Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I'm happy to be joined today by Matthew Ehret. He's a journalist and editor in chief of the Canadian Patriot Review. Matthew is also a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow and an author of the Untold History of Canada book series, as well as the Clash of Two Americas. It's great to have you on, Matthew. How are you?
It's great to be on. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, so you wrote an article on Rhodes Scholars, and I saw it get published on Unlimited Hangout. So it's called The Rhodes Scholars Guiding Biden's Presidency. So you started out by talking about also what's happening in present day with the World Economic Forum, how they have raised a bunch of young leaders. And there's a video of Klaus Schwab talking about these young leaders. He names a few names, and some of which are listed here in this article that you cite. So, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the Young Leaders is well, I mean, there's a few ways to talk about it, but it was
Mm-hmm.
a program begun as an outgrowth of the World Economic Forum as a way to better condition the next generation of leaders, so that thinking long term about the longer waves of history. A lot of those who were big power players around Klaus Schwab, who was just a young sociopathic upstart in the early 70s. They weren't going to live to see through the culmination of a lot of the blueprints that they had committed to for a very long time in terms of the nation stripping of society, the outsourcing of industrial independence in formerly industrialized countries to uh, what we have seen for the past 50 years, which was an outsourcing to cheap labor sweatshops around the world. So we lost our ability to provide for ourselves, our own people. But this is a long process, and the necessary creation culturally of a type of people who would accept a form of fascist dictatorship and let go of their hard fought for freedoms that had been fought for over many generations. That wasn't something that was going to happen very easily. It would take time. So again, as I pointed out, many of those architects knew they weren't going to see through necessarily. They weren't going to live long enough to see the culmination of this. So they focused in 1992 around the creation of a young leaders forum to look for talent that you would hope would be indoctrinated in a process of conferences, workshops, seminars, and really just bring young people into a controlled environment. And when I say young, I'm being a little bit facetious. I mean, it's below the age of 41 or something, so
Mm-hmm.
it's flexible. But the idea would be to really shape and mold the psyche of as many of those who would be upper level managers in the next generation, whether that would be deployed back into the corporate world, into the official layers of government, as Klaus Schwab recently bragged that he was so happy that half of the Canadian cabinet were processed through the global leaders, were young global leaders, and it was given a new name in 2004. But effectively, that was the purpose of it. You know,
Yeah, and you mentioned also that Klaus Schwab is someone who inherited pretty much someone else's ideology. Like he's not his own man. Similar to how all these Rhodes scholars are people who inherited someone else's ideology. So, how far back does this Rhodes Scholars program go?
well, yeah, this is yeah, that's a great question because everyone gets a little. I think it's very popular to talk about the Great Reset and the World Economic
Yeah.
Forum, and that's sort of all the buzz right now. But it's like no, this is just a brand new creation which has very much older precedents. And it's not like the people who are even managing the World Economic Forum themselves are architects of what they're participating in. So there's a higher function to shaping the contour of our recent history, at least since the end of the 19th century, which is a good starting point, I think. Obviously, with history, it's always difficult to know where do you start because everything has a precedent, you know, before and above and beyond what you're looking at. But there, the late 19th century is a great starting point to answer your question because I do talk about the Rhodes Scholars as being one of the more older primordial role models, the templates around which the smaller young leaders thing was set up and modeled around. This was an institution that created or innovated this this scholarship program using the money that had been gained by Cecil Rhodes, who was a horrific racist. He called himself
Mm.
a race patriot, who was sort of the tyrant of much of South Africa today, including Zimbabwe, and that was the Cape Town colony. So that was a British territorial possession. He was the big manager. It was at a certain point called Rhodesia. Um, and he created a lot of institutions, namely De Beers is one still very active global institution, which he created, which manages much of the world diamond mining functions. And he innovated a new form of a very racist control policy of Africa that raped them of a variety of their resources, that stripped the Africans who were living there for, I mean, thousands of years of any ability to participate in their government in any way. And when he died, he set out a will. He studied in Oxford. That was what shaped him as he thinks, a young man, with a religious like purpose to his existence to preserve the British Empire. And this was around the 1870s. He was studying in Oxford. He had some influences around him, like John Ruskin, who was the leader of the Pre-Raphaelite Society, which was an imperial artistic fad. Basically, it was the idea was that we have to that art was more pure before the Renaissance, before the age of Raphael, and that we should go back to the values. That artists should return back to the medieval values before the Renaissance, in order to go back to nature, to become more pure. And it was a very romantic type of school. And essentially, if anybody actually thinks critically about what John Ruskin was saying, he was pretty much saying like that time when 95% of the population were illiterate, like living on a feudal lord's plantation, and the
Mm.
lords were relatively unchallenged in their castles. That's what we like. And the type of cultural aesthetic that we want to promote has got to like reflect that pre-Renaissance culture. And so he had a lot of following. He had a lot of young boys with weird fetishes that would just like clamor around him, as all of these guys tend to do. And Cecil Rhodes came out of that with a passion, and and he wanted to preserve the British Empire because everyone was kind of freaking out at that time in Britain that the empire was disintegrating. There was
Mm.
an electric spread of freedom around the world. There was this idea that nation states could manage their own affairs without having a private British East India Company shoving opium down their throats, or managing the central banks, the private central banks of nations. People were starting to realize, oh, wait a minute, we as a nation state can control and emit our own credit for our own development without relying on the British East India Company or the City of London or their fifth column operations penetrating, Russia or the USA, which was Wall Street. By the way, anybody who thinks that Wall Street is a natively American thing, no, that has from the very beginning been an operation with a blue blood Eastern establishment set of families that have always been loyal to the British Empire and not those who made the U.S. Constitution happen. This has always been the deep state. So anyway, that idea of this global monolith, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire. That was over, and people were really taking their destinies into their own hands and working together cooperatively on big infrastructure projects, the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Lincoln Rail Development Industrialization. You had processes across Asia and South America as well, utilizing protectionism, not British free trade looting. So anyway, there was a big existential crisis. Uh, Rhodes took it upon himself to commit his identity and to preserving and salvaging the British Empire in any way possible. And he wrote a series of wills. And it's very useful because these wills, especially the 1877 Manifesto, became the constitution for his Rhodes Scholarship Program. So when he died, which happened in 1902, all of his money, which was added to by Nathaniel Rothschild and King or Prince Edward Albert, added to the big chunk of cash, and it became the basis to fund what became the again, I mentioned the Rhodes Scholarship. So the idea was setting up scholarships around the world to talent search young people from different parts of the Commonwealth or the empire. At first, it was only for white people. But later on, they expanded it to. They realized, hey, we could, we don't have to discriminate who's going to be our what skin color is going to be on the body of the person who's going to be our tool. So they
Right.
started extending that to everybody. And up until now, there's been 7,000 Americans who have been processed through Oxford. Not all people have been given or have exhibited the same talent. Some are given less points of responsibility. Some I think are just throwaways. But the point is, it's a very controlled environment where they can put them through tests, see who's got the stomach to be the power players of the next generation. And it was managed by a think tank, also funded by the Rhodes Scholarship Program, that interfaces with the Roundtable movement. Or it's called the Roundtable originally, and it was then changed as a name to the Council on Foreign Relations inside the USA, which was the American branch of the British Chatham House, the British Royal Society for International Affairs in 1919, with outlets in Canada and New Zealand and South Africa and Australia, which to this very day remain governing sort of the queen of think tanks managing global grand strategy. And these interface with the Rhodes Scholars every generation.
Yeah, so is there a connection with the young global leaders and Rhodes Scholars in any way?
You got some direct connections, but I think for me, I found the most interesting point of connection was looking at the figure of Klaus Schwab himself, since it's in him that we have the direct connection to his mentor at Harvard, Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger is somebody who had said, I mean, he even bragged at a Chatham House Royal Institute event in May 10th, 1981, which I cite a little bit of his speech. I've got his whole speech as an appendix in my new book on the volume 2 of the Clash of the Two Americas. But Kissinger says, during my time as Secretary of State, I had spent far more time briefing the British Foreign Office than I did my own American State Department. And he describes in the same speech how he was always loyal to the foreign policy outlook of the British Empire and specifically Churchill, in opposition to the other tradition of, because there's two Americas, right? As I say in the title of my book, you've got a better America, which is anti-imperial, which has historically fought against enmeshment in foreign intrigue and global empire. And then you've got this other thing calling itself American, but not really. And so Kissinger lays out how he very much shaped his entire policy on that. Now, Kissinger is a high-level person brought in the late 50s into the Bilderberger Group, as well as into the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a leading figure when he set up the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, which pretty much took over the USA under Carter, but it came in before that. And Klaus Schwab was, again, his young mentee, who installed as a little cardboard cutout to be in charge of an operation in 1971, the same year that he was working to, sever the U.S. dollar from the gold reserve system in the USA and to float it onto the global speculative markets. That was the same month in 1971 that he sets up the World Economic Forum. And if it wasn't Klaus Schwab, it was going to be somebody else, frankly, in order to, again, create and try to manage a new elite, a new golden collar wannabe master class who just they think of themselves as a step above your average mortal. So it's just a culture of elitism that they had to encrust and create to help manage the system, but they're not in control themselves of their own identities. It's a controlled environment, like I said. Another person is Maurice Strong, who is a high-level British Privy Councillor, who is another mentor of Klaus Schwab. And Maurice Strong is a high-level player with the Rockefellers, with David Rockefeller, who he worked under in New York. He's a Canadian. And he set up a variety of these institutions, like the Club of Rome, that he co-founded with a few other people. That does bring us back into the same network, the same roundtable network that was managing the Rhodes Scholars. But again, I wouldn't say that the Rhodes Scholars themselves tend to be at the highest level of thinking either. Oxford was always seen as the school of the doers. So Oxford and the London School of Economics were the two schools. One was the Fabian Society School. Oxford was the Rhodes Scholarship School. And you'll often find the Fabians and the Rhodes Scholars often enmesh and overlap with each other throughout the 20th century. And Cambridge is the school of the thinkers. So you have the mental activity of the empire is primarily you're going to find in the Royal Society of London and Cambridge, whereas the doers, those who get their hands dirty, tend to be processed and operate out of Oxford or the London School of Economics.
Hey, didn't he, Cecil Rhodes, he helped create concentration camps in South Africa in the 1900s. Is that true?
It was actually his followers. So
Okay.
he, by this time, had they were dealing with what's called the Transvaal Republic uprising. so that you had for hundreds of years Dutch settlers in South Africa, the eastern part of South Africa, northeast, that had set up. They basically created a republic. They had a pretty civil relationship with the Zulus as well. There was racism, but it wasn't nearly anything you see coming from like the Belgium or British experience. There was overall a coherent cooperation prospect, and that was a problem for the British. The British wanted full control of this strategic zone, both for its minerals, but also for its geographic location on the world map. So this is where the two Boer Wars came out of it. Were two attempts to suppress and destroy the Boers, the Dutch settlers, and to undo the Transvaal Republic. The first Boer War was a success for the Dutch. The second one, the Dutch were winning for much of the time. 1901, the Dutch were kicking British ass. And at a certain point, Cecil Rhodes had played some dirty, illegal games, had done some inside job false flags that looked really bad, like killing a lot of innocent people, and it looked pretty bad because media got a hold of it at the time. And he had to leave and go back to Britain. And in his stead was a figure with a real, like, stomach of steel named Lord Kitchener. And Kitchener was brought in, and Kitchener worked very closely with Lord Alfred Milner, one of the Cecil Rhodes prodigies, and Milner had what was called Milner's kindergarten, who all became the leaders of the Round Table movement in the 1900s. These are the groups that took control of Britain during the World War I. They're the ones who orchestrated, frankly, the World War I as a completely unnecessary war. They're the ones who shaped the conditions of the League of Nations as the first attempt at a one world government promoting a population control ideology of eugenics. They were the ones behind all of that stuff. Carroll Quigley is a great author for this, by the way. And so Kitchener was the one who innovated the concentration camp system to say, okay, well, we're having a hard time beating the warriors. Again, the Zulus and the whites. They're doing too good of a job. So let's take the war to their families. And so that became what they did. And that broke the morale, where I think it's something like 40,000 or so innocent women and children were killed in these concentration camp systems. They poisoned the water as well. And these were things that a lot of the Nazi high officials were studying when they were trying to innovate how do they go about managing the useless eaters as well. Some of them were also using forced labor. So while you got the bodies there, you're like, well, let's put them to work. Let's have them sew our uniforms and do other things, which is, again, a big part of the Nazi economic miracle, was utilizing millions of slave labor people. That's how they that's how they made a lot of their economic miracles happen, is they just didn't pay their labor, and they just gave them enough food to just stay alive until they just died of starvation 6 months later.
Yeah. So the Nazi concentration camps weren't so original. They modeled it off of some of the programs that were used in South Africa there in the early 1900s. And then earlier you mentioned how the origins of Wall Street started in England, right? So this is where the Rothschilds family was at. And you mentioned that Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, he wanted to halt the spread of the American system around the world after President Abraham Lincoln's victory over the South in the Civil War. So which policies in particular was he trying to halt? Was it like economic policies, equality policies? Which ones was he trying to prevent from spreading?
It's sort of all different parts of the same thing. Like the economic policy of what was nominally then better known as the American system. Today, it's not even taught in school anymore. And here I'm writing. If anybody wants to Google some special names, people who were leaders, intellectual leaders of this system, I would suggest look at Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry C. Carey. You can get his books online still. Friedrich List, who spread this system. He studied in America for 5 years, studying this system, looking at how the U.S. was able to survive its precarious first 20 years after the Great Depression as a underdeveloped country, which was mostly agrarian, full of unpayable debts. 13 states that were completely disunified. Each state was bankrupt. The war bankrupted everybody, and they had no unifying ability to collect taxes, collect tariffs, duties on imports. They had no ability to pay their debts. They had no ability to even work with each other to build any infrastructure that would cross a border. They were fighting with each other. Every state was like fighting for their own survival. So that was not a nation that was going to survive. So you're like, well, how the hell did they get over that storm to the point that they were not only able to pay off all their debts within like 15 years, but their population within 40 years quadrupled 4 times. This, and not just quantitatively. You could look at the measured life expectancy of the American people. it also increased dramatically. Quality of life, the industrial output, like America started producing more than even the British Empire that had the global monopoly on industrial activity. And they got this by playing dirty, right? By cutting off the hands of Indian textile workers and preventing India from having any rights to have the textiles that it had used to become the primary. I mean, the two biggest economic powerhouses at the end of the 18th century were China and India, and by a long shot, long shot. And this had to be destroyed systematically by the British. And they made they allowed pretty much the British technique was to say, okay, what's good for us is protectionism, because they knew if you can protect your local industries, and this is, the idea of having a tariff. So any imports, you can make it more expensive for your local people to purchase external goods, then it becomes cheaper for them to purchase locally. So you stimulate agriculture, industry, whatever you want to put a tariff onto. It's the right of every nation to do it. But under British free trade laws of Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or any of the British, economists, that's illegal. So they would always tell India or China or Ireland or America or anybody, no, you have to play by the rules of free trade. Now, for them, they were never playing by their own rules, because they knew how this works, right? Because as soon as you start doing protectionism, you could protect yourself. It's like having a shield in battle, right? And also state credit. So the utilization of a national bank to emit credit for the development of internal improvements of industry, because if you have industries, a machine can do the work of 100 physical human laborers. You could then seriously start freeing slaves, because if you're just dependent upon human like cheap slave labor, if that's your dependency, you can't free your slaves, because if you free your slaves, you lose your economy. The whole Southern slave power, which was based on this formula of exporting their cotton to the British, who was buying all the cotton from the South, they couldn't free their slaves, right? It was just not cost effective. So that's today why that's how the current globalization works too. We're dependent upon the sweatshop labor of people who have to stay poor in Mexico or other parts of the world in order for their labor to stay poor, to be paid $1 a day. And we tell ourselves, oh, but at least it's $1 a day. And it's like, no, it's economic slavery. They're not allowed to develop, because their labor would become more expensive if they developed. So that was the same problem then. And so the way that Friedrich List, who became the founder of the German Customs Union that unified Germany to a state in 1840, 1850, a lot of this was disrupted by the anarchist movements of the Young Europe movement, for example, that people like Marx and Engels came out of, which was basically weaponize the poor and have them become battering rams against the the nation state, good and bad alike. And but they were studying Alexander Hamilton, and how did Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary, he was killed in 1804 in a duel. But Alexander Hamilton was able to unify all of the debts into a new federal debt, and this new debt was tied to a national bank. And that national bank, you could have private investors in the bank, but they couldn't be directors. They couldn't manage the behavior of the bank. So they could make a profit off the bank investing in things that were profitable, but they couldn't determine what those investments were going to be. Which is why people often attack Hamilton, saying, "Oh, but he's a Rothschild tool." And no, he was not a Rothschild tool. His enemies were the Rothschild tools, who undid his bank and killed him. But if you look at what he did, the new debt became the way that the government capitalized the investments into not just the money, but also the loans to businesses, farmers, but then also infrastructure like the Erie Canal, big giant project that took 30 years, but it gave a long-term thinking to society, and upgraded the industrial output to the point that, like I said, America was outproducing Britain in almost everything within a very short period of time. And the British oligarchical sort of grand strategists were thinking, how do we undo this? They killed Hamilton. Ironically, the guy who killed Hamilton was Aaron Burr, the vice president of the USA, using the same gun that killed Hamilton's son the year earlier, or no, 2 years earlier. So there's a story there, like there was the same gun in the same location that Hamilton's talented son got killed by one of Aaron Burr's assets. Forgot his name. And they used the same guns in the same location when Alexander Hamilton gets killed by Burr. So there's something going on there. Point is, Aaron Burr is the guy who was the founding father of America's deep state. He's the guy who founded the Bank of Manhattan using money that was supposed to go to a water project when he was vice president. And he basically started this private bank, which became the basis of JP Morgan, the entire Wall Street apparatus. And so, yeah, that was spreading around the world. Just to be quick, to get back to your question, it was protectionism, it was state credit, It was cooperation with your neighbors. So that rather than going to war with your neighbors or speculating, it was work with your neighbors on mutual development win-win projects, which is why you had things like the rail development from Russia going down into Manchuria, into China. You had the leaders of France, like Sadi Carnot, the president, who also got assassinated, working with Bismarck, working with Sergei Witte, the leaders of Russia, around building rail together. Also, the Berlin to Baghdad railway to industrialize and modernize the Ottoman Empire was moving ahead very fast. And that all of that was crushed. All of that was destroyed with a lot of assassinations, starting with Lincoln, and then Garfield, and then McKinley. And there's like 30 different assassinations of high-level people who were all taken out before Archduke Ferdinand was killed finally in 1914. That was the catalyzer for World War I. But that had to go. A lot of color revolutions had to happen in Russia that disrupted this flow. And they kicked over the chessboard pretty much.
And your article also mentions the Council of Foreign Relations.
Yeah.
So it's inaccurate to say that this is an American organization, right? Do you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah. Well, it was set up in the same meeting in France in 1919 that was presided over by Lionel Curtis, who was one of Milner's boys. At the time, he became a leading figure at the Round Table. So at this 1919 meeting that coincided with the Paris Peace Agreements, which also created the League of Nations, all of these things were the same thing, is what created the original Royal Institute for International Affairs. It was at the Majesté Hotel of Paris. And you had the key players who had set up the Federal Reserve who were present. People like Paul Warburg was a leading member of this group. Who's another one? Edward Mandelhaus, an advisor under Woodrow Wilson, who would also play a key role setting up the J.P. Morgan-controlled, Rothschild-controlled Federal Reserve in 1913. They were all there. And so the first thing they needed to set up, the idea was, how do we create an Anglo-American special relationship to retie the destiny of the USA back into the British Empire? Because the Americans obviously had a lot of anti-Britishness. This was not an easy sell at the time, and for good reason. So the idea was, okay, let's start with these two key think tanks, and the British version that was set up in that conference was, again, sometimes they call it Chatham House, but it's the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And then they were like, okay, well, we need the American branch, and at first they were going to call it the American Institute for International Affairs, but they're like, sounds a little bit too close to what we're calling our thing in Britain, so let's call it something else. And they chose Council on Foreign Relations to make it seem a little less British, but all of the same founders. And if you look at who is managing this thing, who's a member, who throughout the entire 20th century, people like Ivy Lee, who's working closely with Edward Bernays, who's working closely with the British oligarchs, is the first president of it. They're oftentimes, usually you'll find a lot of Oxford-trained Rhodes Scholars embedded in that thing, and a lot of Fabians too, that are managing this thing that seems, again, American. I mean, Hillary Clinton, if anybody doesn't realize this, Hillary Clinton in 2011 called this thing the mothership, all right, when she was referring to the Council on Foreign Relations. And everybody, it's like the cool club, like that's the club you really want to be in if you want to be a player in Washington. But yeah, it gets its commands from Britain. It's not itself an indigenously American operation. But it was only set up in 1921. There was a lot of pushback from members of the Republican and Democratic Party in government who were like, no, we don't want this thing, and they stopped it for 2 years from setting root in the USA. And it finally did set up in 21. And it was around that same time that the League of Nations, which was also created out of this conference as a way to get rid of the national sovereignty over military, was set up. And that was supposed to replace national sovereignty early on. But it was, again, only because these nationalists and patriots, who then were mobilizing around the figure of Warren Harding, the underappreciated, assassinated American president who died in very mysterious circumstances eating bad oysters in 1924. But these were the same networks who did battle successfully and fought against this League of Nations becoming the governing authority of the world under its covenant, which had like a NATO collective security pact in its Article 10. If any one member of the League gets into a war, everybody has to militarily get into the same war. That's like a perfect recipe for the empire to just create chaos forever. So that was sabotage. Again, that was the first attempt at a new world order from the 20th century.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, then how did Rhodes Scholars start flooding the US's presidential administration? And then before that, they were also flooding the Ivy League schools, media outlets, corporations, elected offices, as well as other institutions. So how were they able to accomplish that?
It's through permeation theory. So they were operating on the post World War II strategy was a little bit different from the pre World War II strategy. There was a bit of a dispute with the Fabians and the Round Table. So they had different strategies, and the Fabians were more of the view. And this I'm talking about people like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Halford Mackinder. Um, there's a long list, but the Fabian Society were of the approach that no, we have to have patience. Our problems have been as an empire, we're not patient enough. We don't penetrate enough. We have to be able to wear a lot of costumes at the same time, acting like we don't think what we think, you know. And they were all utilizing the same Jesuitical tactics. And in fact, Cecil Rhodes even points out in his will that the Jesuit constitution has to be what they model their own Rhodes Scholarship on. But the problem was a lot of the Milner, old school, stiff upper lip British imperial racists, um, they weren't good for patients. They had so much disdain for darker skinned people who they thought were below them that they just wanted to crush the savages. And so their lack of patience often blew up in their face, as we saw with, I mean, World War One was a bit of a British imperial disaster in many ways. Like the British, they did come out in some ways on top by managing the 1919 Versailles agreements, but they also lost quite a bit. It was a risky maneuver. And then World War II, their own Hitler machine that they had put a lot of effort into growing and funding as an economic miracle solution to the Great Depression, that was funded and steered by the old nobility that operated in the city of London, the Bank of England, Montague Norman, and a lot of their American offspring like Prescott Bush and the Rockefeller Foundation and other things. You know, you can't account for how Hitler rose to power if you don't look at this Anglo-American fascist apparatus that never got punished in Nuremberg. But again, what Hitler didn't win. That whole New World Order agenda for a fascist, Hitler was supposed to be with Mussolini and Franco and others, the fascist enforcers on behalf of a banker's dictatorship above them. And at a certain point, they realized, well, wait a minute, we can be the ones in charge. Why do we have to be the ones who are the junior partner? Why can't we run the show and Britain can be our junior
Mm-hmm.
partner, right? And Hitler started listening to his generals a little bit more, stopped listening to his handlers like Lord Halifax in Britain, and some of the British were more than happy. The elites were more than happy to accommodate this new Nazi-run New World Order, and other ones were like, "Well, no, we're not willing to make that sacrifice," and they had to put down their Frankenstein monster, but it blew up in their face. And so coming out of that, they realized, okay, we have to go with the Fabian approach more. We have to take the Fabians more seriously. And so things shifted gears a little bit, and the permeation theory became much more transgenerational thinking. So you just facilitate when you achieve a position of power or influence within a university. You make it as easy as possible for others who have been through your same conditioning. A few years later, the younger blood to rise as much as possible, to fill and to control the zone of whatever you want to influence in government or in the private sector. You try to purge as many people who have thoughts that are not in accord with your thinking. So people who shared Franklin Roosevelt's vision of a post-imperial world governed by cooperating nation states of China, Russia, and the USA, which was what Roosevelt had mobilized for, was to create this, including also Brazil was supposed to be involved as one of the other pillars. And the whole thing was supposed to be premised around the idea of internationalizing the New Deal, electrifying the Tennessee Valley Authority for Africa, for India. All of the people who were in positions of authority in intelligence, in academia, in government had to be purged, and they were purged. They were all called red commie traitors, and their careers were destroyed. Some were assassinated. And so that's how this thing sort of works. It's, again, permeation theory, and this is where the Fabian
Mm-hmm.
Society logo of the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's actually what George Bernard Shaw commissioned, and there's the famous stained glass mirror that he commissioned of a wolf literally wearing a dead sheep, its skin, and you just have to pass evil under the radar utilizing a veneer of virtue. And it's these same characters who shaped the entire Cold War. I mean, you got people like Dean Rusk, Rhodes Scholar, who shaped the Korean War and Vietnam Wars. You got George McGee, who shaped the Truman Doctrine, that it finally created the Anglo-American special relationship and basically made American foreign policy in 1946, premised around the idea of saving the British Empire, because the idea was the British Empire is a bastion against Soviet communism. And so it's now in America's interest to save the British Empire economically everywhere it's located, and to enmesh the USA into fascist, completely unnecessary wars in Greece, and then soon in the Koreas, and then Vietnam, and everywhere else. So that was, again, a Rhodes Scholar, George McGee, and Senator Fulbright, again, Rhodes Scholar, Fulbright Scholarship program. That's another appendage of this thing. People like Madeleine Albright went through that. That was another appendage of the thought control system, and he was a big promoter of world government. They all are. They're all promoters of world government and the idea of overcoming nation states. And so for the last part of your question, when did this really take over?
Yeah.
I think the presidential system, they were never able to capture the presidency. They were always in advisory positions throughout the Cold War, and it was only with the rise of Bill Clinton that we saw the biggest infusion, because Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, and people like Strobe Talbot was his roommate, another Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. And we had something like 26 high-level Rhodes Scholars sweep into the presidency in 1992, and Ira Magaziner and Robert Reich and others. A huge list. I've got it in my article. And my books too. But that was sort of the first infusion. Susan Rice, Bruce Reed also came in as Rhodes Scholars, who then came back in full force under Obama, and then we see them now under Biden and company.
Yeah, a lot of these Rhodes Scholars were like what you were just describing, wolves in sheep's clothing, pretending to be the saviors. People want to actually see positive change, but they hear the right rhetoric, the right language from people's speeches, like Biden's speeches, or others like Pete Buttigieg. And people like Pete Buttigieg, also a Rhodes Scholar, which you also discussed in your article, he worked with the CIA. I mean, he worked with the CIA in Afghanistan, and he was also groomed prior to becoming a Rhodes Scholar. So is it commonplace now to use the CIA as an institution to train and brainwash people before they become Rhodes Scholars, or at the same time? How commonplace is that?
It's something I've been meaning to spend a lot more time doing a better deep dive on, but I sense you're right. You tend to see a lot of overlap, and it's hard to find
Yeah.
any type of institution with influence these days where the CIA doesn't have their hands all over it, right?
Yeah.
Anywhere. And I think the important thing in this, again, the historical context is always super important, because people think of, again, the CIA as this American operation, and the fact is, as soon as Roosevelt died, and again, there was never an autopsy, and Roosevelt had even said to his assistant, who was also his son, Elliot, that my State Department is completely controlled by Churchill's people. He was very much aware that he's the only person that he could trust. It had been completely taken over. When he died in April 12th, it didn't take long for his enemies to take full control. Harry Truman is kind of like a George Bush Jr. character, not a big intellect of the day. And with him was this entire Churchill himself came and lived in the White House for like a month to sort of school and groom Truman. Nobody thought that was weird. And so what happens? It takes not that long for the OSS, which was sort of the American intelligence apparatus that was set up in 1942. It was a mixed bag. It had a lot of bad people in it. Allen Dulles was one, but a lot of bad people who preferred this Anglo-American empire way of managing the world, this hegemonic Pax Americana. The British, as Churchill said, British brains and American brawn will rule the world. So a lot of the intelligence officers like Allen Dulles were perfectly happy with that. Other ones were actually, though, real patriots, real nationalist patriots who were anti-empire, who wanted to destroy this way of thinking, and they were all purged when the OSS was destroyed in, I think it was September of 1945. It was just canceled. People who didn't get along with the new rules of the Cold War, they were called red commies, and they lost their security clearance. They lost everything. And the good ones, the well-behaved ones, they were the ones who became the leaders of the new the new CIA that was formed in September 1947 under the Truman Doctrine. But again, it was completely managed by MI6, by a lot of by British advisors, and it was mediated through Camp X originally, in the whole Anglo-American Special Intelligence sharing was operated through Canada. That's why Camp X in Oshawa was set up originally by William Stevenson, and it was a takeover. It was a coup d'état, and people like Eisenhower was pretty dumb. I don't think he was evil, but he was pretty like willing to go along with some very bad things, you know. But he tried to push back, and we all saw his warning of the growth of the military-industrial complex. That he was trying to warn the people, as well as Kennedy. Kennedy was legit. He fought tooth and nail against this thing. He fired Dulles and Charles Cabell, the second in command. He rejected the false flags that were being pushed onto him, like Operation Northwoods, right, to blame the Soviets or blame the Cubans for shooting down an American passenger jet. So Kennedy was legitimate. He was good, but his whole cabinet was full of these deep state operatives, who ended up really running roughshod after he died, especially in Vietnam, enmeshing the U.S. ever more into these insane wars that never should have happened. And yeah, all that to say, the CIA itself is just, it's not, it's always been an insurrectionary force within the USA masquerading as a US thing. But if you look at it, it is really not that at all. So that's the first thing. And yeah, you'll find their operatives, people on the payroll in Operation Mockingbird. They've committed war against their own people on a variety of levels, intellectually as well as with MK Ultra, which was done to psychologically destroy, to figure out how do you best break down the psyche of not just foreign people, but also the American people, and then reconstruct the American people's persona in the image of the master class that you want to, govern the sheep, right? So people have to stop thinking about life as freedom loving humans. They have to be now hedonistic, pleasure hungry sheep that are very atomized. And so the CIA's operations were big in all of these venues. And yeah, you'll find them all over. It's all. There's still some good people. I've noticed that there are the outliers once in a while from within American intelligence, because there's not just one American intelligence. The CIA has sub branches, sub departments, and there's sometimes a good thing that happens. Like, some people will, in 2009, what was it, 2007, right, when Dick Cheney was right about to bomb Iran on the precedent that Iran had a nuclear weapons program, and we were so close to bombing Iran. It was when Cheney went into heart surgery that a group within the CIA released a national intelligence estimate public, and basically made this thing really well known that actual American intel had demonstrated that the Iranians had let go of their weapons ambitions back in 2002. And it took all the wind out of the sails. So you don't want to overly, I say this now just because I don't want people to overly simplify things, because sometimes you'll find a Rhodes Scholar doing something useful as an outlier, or somebody in the CIA will sometimes do something useful, but it's it's an outlier. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned in your article you're not trying to paint everybody there who's a Rhodes Scholar with a broad brush. It's more of like a brainwashing program, you'd say, that some people, because of all everyone has their own unique experiences.
Yeah.
Some people just happen to go through certain experiences where they don't go with what the majority is thinking. Something just hits them, and then they just don't go along with all these imperial decisions that a lot of these Rhodes Scholars in high positions want to go through. So you mentioned also Susan Rice, right? She's someone that was influenced by the brainwashing of the Rhodes Scholars Program. Mm-hmm. And then during her time as Barack Obama's national security advisor, she was involved with some actions in South Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, the Arab Spring. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, just to be clear, I just pulled up a quote here. But she even gave a speech in 1999 at the Rhodes House in Oxford, saying to be at Rhodes House tonight with so many friends, benefactors, and mentors is a personal privilege. It is like a coming home for me, for much of what I know about Africa was discovered within these walls, refined at this great university with generous support from the Rhodes Trust. And yeah, her work. she was infused. I think it was in 1994 or 95 into the Clinton administration, and she was in charge of African affairs in the State Department. She played a very very key role in the creating the conditions around which the Americans bombed the Sudanese pharmaceutical factory in 1998, which was producing um, affordable AIDS medication, which basically the Sudanese were not allowed to do that. You had to stick with control by Pfizer, whichever other big pharma cartel was demanding Africa pay out of the wazoo for these things. She was the special assistant to Bill Clinton, um, and she in 2009 when she came back again, yeah, she played a big role in the giving up of the Sudan into a North and a South Sudan because at the time, President Bashir, who later on got a warrant on his head by a Soros-funded organization called the International Criminal Court, which is really it's not a legitimate court in any serious way, but it was created by with a lot of Soros money in the late 90s to pretty much justify regime change operations against nationalist leaders you don't like, mostly in Africa, but also beyond. And Bashir at the time, 2007, 2008, he was moving the Sudanese, which is a very mineral-rich strategic zone, into an alliance with President Gaddafi of Libya, as well as Mubarak of Egypt. The three of them were actually breaking away, and Libya was leading the charge with a new dinar that would be gold backed and tied to national programs like the Great Man-Made Water Project of Libya that NATO destroyed in 2011 under the again Susan Rice played a certain role in that. And during this time, 2009, yeah, she was the biggest advocate for pulling Bashir, who was cooperating with Gaddafi, into the criminal court, and also trying to say that Bashir was doing all of these massacres of their own Christian minority people in the South. That was actually not even true. When you look at it, a lot of this was psyop, kind of like look at all of the people in Ukraine that the Russians are raping and killing. And as soon as you start scratching on the surface, a lot of these claims are like, there's actually nothing there. It was a staged operation. Um, but it worked, and Sudan was forced to break up, which is still a problem today as part of a divide to conquer strategy. Um, yeah, and she had a lot of business relations with Kagame and other freaks at the time. I think Kagame might be doing maybe something a bit better nowadays, but throughout the 1990s and this whole period, um, he was playing a role as a puppet on behalf of his masters in Washington, carrying out genocide in Rwanda or funding genocide in Rwanda, which was again another artificial genocide in the 90s, funded by a Belgian British operation with some American players that made sure that Hutus and Tutsis killed each other in a war to basically justify world government. The idea was to create something disastrous that could be then used for PR purposes to show the Western world that look what happens when you allow sovereign nation states to just do whatever they do, genocide. That's why we need one world government. That's why we need responsibility to protect the R2P protocol that was brought in by people like Soros, by Rice, by Lord Malloch Brown, who was at the time a high level person at the UN, to justify the idea of liberal imperialism. That it's okay to invade and bomb a country in order to prevent a humanitarian disaster. So there's certain types of humanitarian disasters that are okay as long as they prevent other types that we don't like. And that was again that's what the Rwandan genocide was always all about.
And then they made a movie about it, Hotel
Mm.
Rwanda, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you so going into the future, like some of the plans that people like the like Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, something that they want to do in the future is focus more on environmental crises, so that they can implement some of their economic policies, their global economic policies. And one of the other mayors who were trained by the CIA, well, like Pete Buttigieg, was Mayor Garcetti from Los Angeles, and his role was in pushing the Green New Deal, which you mentioned was an integral part of the Great Reset and expanding all these green cities. So, to people who don't know about how smart cities are going to be a thing, that this is something that the World Economic Forum is trying to push to ramp up more surveillance and more
Mhm.
control over the population, why would green cities be a bad thing to the people who don't know? Because people can see that climate change is an issue. We want to have a cleaner environment. So why would a green city be bad?
Mhm. Yeah, it's like how can you how can you say anything bad about a pollution-free green world? We all like greenery and we all like ecosystems and no one likes pollution. So it's like, okay, so whatever you say I should do, then that sounds like great. And
Yeah.
that's again how you get evil to creep in under the surface. You'll never let it into your house if it says, "Hey, I'm evil. Can I come in?" And like
You got
right
to have a
there,
wolf in sheep's clothing,
gotta have
like you
that wolf. Yeah,
mentioned.
you gotta have that sheepskin's got to be there. Otherwise, you won't let the wolf in. So this is the thing: the sleight of hand that occurred in I would say this really got underway in a serious manner with the retweaking of population control science after World War II. Since eugenics, the science of population control, the sterilization of the unfit, useless eaters, things like that, that was a big part of the Hitler program. It was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And as Julian Huxley makes the point, it became unpopular when the world got to see the consequence of what this actually looks like when it's really vigorously put into action. So eugenics became, as Julian Huxley says, the founder of UNESCO, in his manifesto in 1946, which people can still read online. He says it's the most important of all sciences. It's the science of sciences, but we can't really say the word anymore because it's gotten a bad rap, and that's Hitler's fault. So we have to basically find a way to make the unthinkable become thinkable again, and to focus on the young, focus on those being born after World War II, the baby boomers. That's who we're going to put all of our efforts into. The older generation is still they've got their traditions that we're probably not going to break that so easily. So we're going to focus on the young, and we'll give it a new name. And what you look at, what is he doing? That same year, he sets up the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the world's first conservation organization that he founds with a bunch of oligarchs from Britain who, like Max Nicholson, a privy councillor, and leading figures who are also doing like safari killing white rhinos and stuff. Like they don't really care about nature, but they're setting up these big nature preservation funds. Julian Huxley, while he's still the president of the British Eugenics Society, right, in 1961, he co-founds the World Wildlife Fund for Nature with Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard. Prince Bernhard having just founded the Bilderberger groups in 1954, the three of them. Now, the British Eugenics Society, keep in mind, it kept going as a name, and it changed its name only in 1988 to the Galton Institute, which is tied to Gavi and the entire Bill Gates apparatus that's taken over control of the World Health Organization. It's still there. It's behind the whole vaccine protocol policy. Um, Now, the idea of this, why were all these oligarchs who don't really care about nature, they don't like people, why were they doing these things to save nature? It's because it wasn't nature that they wanted to protect. It was that they wanted to shift the values of society from a society that had formerly cherished the idea of saving human beings or liberating human beings from empire to saving nature from human beings. And that was the sleight of hand. And again, they focused again on a lot of the young. They made our society completely useless by becoming a services consumer cult. So people would just become disgusted with their own hedonism over time. That's just what always happens when you let like license and vice just become like rampant. You know that the consequence will be people will get disgusted with their own. This is how the white slave owners managed the slaves in the Confederate South. They would make sure that the one holiday period of the year they took all of the male slaves to a brothel. The white slave owners made a practice over decades where they would just get them so drunk and so debauched that they were ashamed of their freedom, and they told the slaves, "That's your freedom." And the slaves were then so ashamed that they were happy to work or willing to work stoically for 15, 16 hours, for the rest of the year every day. And when somebody would say, "Hey, you want freedom? Let's go. Let's get out of here." They're like, "No, freedom's bad." And that's what's happened to a lot of the young people today, right? Who are just looking in their 20s. They're looking at the destruction of the baby boomers and the hedonism and the destruction to the environment, and they're like, "Oh, you know, human beings are really a virus. We're the problem. That's why there's immigration problems. It's not that we bombed countries to the Stone Age. No, no, it's their climate migration. You know, they're
Yeah.
that's what we're told that they are. And COVID, we're even told COVID is caused by the climate crisis. I've seen studies that are promoting this. And so if you get everybody into this new ethic where they think, okay, I have to think small, think little, nation states are bad, nation states cause pollution, they're just corrupt, they cause wars. Maybe we do need these new global authorities to reduce our carbon footprints, to force quotas of decarbonization, which we're told is causing climate change, which frankly is not. We're on the verge of an ice age. Anybody looking at astroclimatology will tell you, like, climate change, which used to be called the weather, is being driven primarily by the sun, and we're on the verge of an ice age. This global warming thing caused by human CO2, that's a whole show unto itself. But that's actually a statistical fraud, as real as like COVID is dangerous. It's that. I don't know if this is going to go on YouTube, but if it is, I might have just got your video shut down. I'm sorry.
Oh, we're here on YouTube. But I'll put a
Oh,
disclaimer. Don't worry.
okay, all
I'll
right.
add, yeah. Every
Yeah,
time I mention COVID, like I add that disclaimer, and they usually leave me
they're cool.
alone. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, these smart cities, that's part of it. It's just part of the control thing. Get everybody to just think local, live into very tiny little units in your house. Don't have a house anymore. Don't think about having abundance anymore. Think that's part of the old globalization neoliberal model that was always designed to collapse, by the way. That's why globalization was put into motion, was to turn our economy into a time bomb. Now that the time bomb is collapsing, the new system being introduced is the Great Reset idea that's been there the whole time as a solution concept, waiting for the appropriate crisis. And now just abide by the new green ethic of, don't have babies. If there's no such thing as genders anyway, and be in a very controlled world, and if you want to eat meat, or you want to use gasoline in your car tank, well, we're gonna find ways of punishing you with social credit scores that are gonna maybe make sure that you don't have enough money from our universal basic income program to pay for everything you want. So you have to have the right behavior if you want to, keep your nose above water. So it's technocratic feudalism. It's not real. They don't really care about humans or nature or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a controlled opposition.
Yeah.
Like you were mentioning earlier, wolves in sheep's clothing. They got to manufacture consent for people somehow. People, I get the sense, inherently want to do good. Like
Oh
they
yeah.
want to help people out. At least the majority of people do. So they gotta make people think that we're doing everything for the right reasons,
Yep.
but really it's just for the agendas of these few ruling families that control everything. So Matthew Ehret, it was a pleasure to have you on again. His article is called "The Rhodes Scholars Guiding Biden's Presidency." So, do you have anything coming up? You want to give any shout outs to some
Yeah.
stuff you got?
Sure. I just produced with my wife the last book of my trilogy, The Clash of the Two Americas Part 3. So if people want to get those, they can get them on the Canadian Patriot or CanadianPatriot.org. That's my main website I set up in 2012. They've also my Untold History of Canada 4-volume series is available there too. If they want a copy, they could email me at info@risingtidefoundation.net, and I'll send a signed copy if you want to buy it that way, or if you want to avoid Amazon. The other thing is the RisingTideFoundation.net has a bit more of a cultural organization. It says Tide in it. It has no affiliation with Soros. People freak out with the word. Just Rising Tide Foundation is the name of the organization I set up in 2019 here in Montreal to promote more education, classical humanist education, and a focus on understanding different cultures, since we're all being set up right now psychologically to go to World War III with China or with Russia or other. And so the reason why we're going along with these types of foolish psyops and misinfo is because we just don't know enough of other cultures, traditions, and histories. So we try to focus on that on that platform.
Yeah, there's a lot of subtopics that can spring out of this conversation too. I wish I could ask, but there's not enough time. But yeah, Matthew, thank you very much for your knowledge on this show. A lot of valuable information here, and to everybody else, stay informed. Thank you
Bye.
guys for watching.